You stand before it. The dim light reflects the curves of the cold metal. A question slowly echoes in your mind. Were medieval women really locked in this thing, for months, years? No one answers. Only the silence of the museum and the sound of the night rain lead you on a journey between truth and legend. A journey that will begin from that silent chastity belt. In the howling wind, Charles heard the cries of women, the roar of abandoned hounds, and the sound of horses' hooves fading away, like ghosts retreating into the forest. The snow melted into cold water on his young cheeks, but his eyes burned with quiet observation. No fear, no screams, the boy stood still as a rock, taking it all in. Behind him, the heavy wooden door opened. A bearded man in a fur cloak stepped out. It was King Pepin, father of Charles, the new king of the Franks, who had just been blessed by the Pope. He followed his son's gaze and sighed. "What do you see, Charles?" His voice was low and husky. "I see a dying land, father," he replied, his voice low but firm. Pepin put his hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the coldness of his thin sweater and the small body trembling slightly. He bent down, looking into his son's eyes. "Remember this, Charles. A king needs more than a sword, he also needs a heart that remembers those who are crying out there. One day, when I am no longer here, you will have to turn this fear into strength." The boy nodded. A seed had just been planted in his heart, the will to control the destiny of this land. The following months passed in a persistent cold and the smell of crude gunpowder. Charles grew up surrounded by the sound of trumpets and stories of war with the Lombards, the Saxons, and the barbarians of the north. In the castle hall, when the lords came to court, the boy sat quietly in a corner, watching his father's every move, remembering how he held power in his hands, sometimes with gold, sometimes with steel. One winter night, Charles followed his father to the edge of the icy river, where the guards had brought back a group of refugees. The women held their children, their faces covered with soot, shivering with cold and hunger. Pepin bent down and covered one of the children with his cloak. He said softly, so that only his son could hear, "This is why we need a strong kingdom. Not for our glory, but to keep these eyes from looking at us." That night, Charles had trouble sleeping. He lay on his wooden bed, listening to the wind whistling outside the window, remembering the eyes of the child by the river. In his dreams, he saw a giant map stretching across Europe, the lands like scattered pieces. In his dreams, he saw himself riding through snow and over mountains, carrying the blue and yellow flag of the Franks, and the burning villages gradually disappeared, giving way to the sound of church bells ringing in the winter sky. One early spring morning, while the fog had yet to lift, Charles followed his father to the barracks. The fields were filled with cavalry training, the sound of horses' hooves and the clash of steel echoed everywhere. Pepin handed his son a wooden sword. "Take it. If you want to be king, you must learn to handle a sword before you can handle a scepter." The boy gripped the hilt of the sword, his hands shaking slightly but his eyes determined. For the first time, Charles felt the weight of power, even though it was only light wood. The instructor placed him opposite another trainee boy, also holding a wooden sword. When the shout rang out, Charles charged. He was clumsy, knocked to the ground, the cold snow sticking to his cheek. Pepin stepped forward, not helping the boy up, only saying, "The king is truly not afraid of falling. Get up." Charles stood up, took a deep breath. The second time, he approached more slowly, looking straight at his opponent. This time, when the wooden swords met, he dodged the blow, then turned and pushed hard. The boy opposite him backed away, lost his balance and fell. Pepin chuckled. "Good. Someday you will have to stand up more than this. The world will try to knock you down more than once." That summer, Charles followed his father's small army to the frontier. For the first time, he saw a siege fortress. The smell of smoke, the shouts, the trumpets, and the clash of swords against shields mingled into a music of war. Pepin stood his son on a small hill, looking down on the scene. "Look, Charles. This is how kingdoms are won or lost. Not in synagogues, not in churches, but in places like this." The boy nodded. His heart was pounding in his chest, both fearful and excited. He felt like he was standing on the threshold of a destiny he did not yet fully understand, But deep down he knew that one day, his horse's hooves would lead all these battles. Winter came again. Charles had grown a year older, stronger and taller, his eyes growing sharper, but in his heart he still held the silent flame of the promise by the wall. The Frankish lands were still in turmoil, but amid the north winds, a boy was beginning to transform into the warrior of the future. Above, the sky was gray and covered with snow, but for him, it was only the beginning of a long dream, a dream that history would later call by a single name, Charlemagne, father of Europe. In 768, autumn had turned the northern forests golden, and funeral bells rang in the Frankish palace. King Pepin, the pragmatic and courageous king, had breathed his last. In the cold stone hall, flickering candlelight fell on the shields hanging on the walls, reflecting the tense faces of the lords. Charles stood silently beside his father's coffin. As the chants rang out, he felt the weight of the kingdom rest on his shoulders. But right beside him, his younger brother Charlemagne, his face pale in the candlelight, had a claim to the throne as well. According to Frankish custom, the throne would be divided between two brothers, each ruling half the kingdom. As the funeral ended, a chill of autumn air crept into the great hall. For the first time, Charles felt alone amidst the high walls and the watchful eyes of the lords. In the weeks that followed, Charles and Charlemagne sat on parallel thrones in the palace hall. Below, lords knelt, but their eyes were divided, and their loyalties were stretched taut like a broken string. Charlemagne was quiet, his thin hands always fiddling with his rosary, listening more to the advice of the monks than the generals. Charles, on the other hand, was lively, his eyes always on the frontier, where the Saxons were stirring up trouble in the north. One day, urgent news came. The Saxons have crossed the border. They are burning villages, robbing and killing people. Charles stood up immediately. We must march now. Otherwise, they will regard the Franks as cowards. Charlemagne frowned, his voice trembling. We should pray and negotiate. War will shed the blood of our people. The hall fell silent. The lords looked at each other, half willing to fight, the other half listening to Charlemagne. Charles clenched his fists, feeling helpless as the throne split in two. That night, Charles stepped out into the castle courtyard, looking up at the starry sky. Memories of his father's words from the castle walls came back to him. He had promised to turn his fear into strength, but now his fear took another form, division. In the darkness, he saw a bleak future, a kingdom divided in two, enemies lurking from all sides. There was only one true throne, and sooner or later someone would fall. The winter of 771 came in a thick fog, covering the Rhine plain. The Frankish kingdom was divided and silent. Charles, then in his early 20s, was still busy reviewing his troops and training his cavalry in the north. Meanwhile, Charlemagne rarely left his monastery, living within the cold stone walls, where the church bells rang steadily but far from the breath of war. One early winter morning, as Charles was riding along the frontier, the messenger came hurrying through the snow, panting and pale. Your Majesty! Urgent news from Soissons Palace. Charlemagne is dead. Charles pulled on his horse's reins and stood still in the middle of the white field. The cold wind blew through his cloak, but he felt nothing but the shock deep inside him. His frail younger brother, his political rival and part of his family, had gone as suddenly as a candle blown out by the wind. Charlemagne's funeral was simple. Prayers rang out in the gray abbey, incense smoke rose into the cold mist. Charles stood before the coffin, his eyes deep. He remembered the debates in the great hall, the different looks between the two brothers on their thrones. A feeling of pity mixed with a sense of fate rose up. In that moment, Charles realized, the throne now had only one person left. Destiny had chosen him. Soon the Frankish lords gathered in the great hall at Noyon. By the flickering light of torches and candles, they knelt, placed their hands on their swords, and swore allegiance to Charles. The cry of "Vive le roi Charles" echoed off the thick stone walls. Charles climbed the steps and stood in the shimmering light. A new fire burned in his heart, both determination and a promise to himself. From this day forward, nothing will divide this kingdom. Blood and steel will unite it, and my name will resound throughout Europe. That night, in the palace, Charles walked alone out into the long, moonlit corridor. He placed his hand on the sword at his side, feeling the weight of power and loneliness. In the distance, the night sky was black, and in Charles's mind, images of distant lands, Lombards, Saxons, Spain, rose like challenges. The path of a king was open, and it was the path of war. In the spring of 774, the wind from the south carried the smell of damp earth and the warmth of early summer. The Frankish kingdom was now firmly in the hands of Charles, the young king to whom the lords had just sworn allegiance. But news from the south brought a desperate cry for help. The Lombards are besieging the Pope in Rome. The news burned like a fire in Charles's mind. He understood that this was not just a religious cry for help, but an opportunity to consolidate Frankish power and prestige. If he could save the Pope, he would become the defender of Christianity, a title that could open up Europe. Within weeks, Charles had assembled a mighty army. Thousands of cavalry and infantry were massed on the Italian border, their banners flying in the wind. As he rode along the line, his eyes were cold and his voice boomed. "Franks, we are not just going to fight. We are going to write our names in history." The cheers rose like thunder, mixed with the sound of horses' hooves and the clash of steel. The journey across the Alps began. It was a path so arduous that it seemed only gods could overcome it. The columns stretched for miles, crossing steep paths and cliffs. The wind from the mountaintops blew bitterly, the snow covered everything, and the wheels of the supply wagons slid down the cliffs several times. Charles rode at the head of the horse, his fur cloak flapping in the wind. Every time he looked down at the misty valley below, he felt that the path of a true king had begun, a path measured in sweat, blood, and steely will. Many soldiers fell from cold and exhaustion, but the army continued to advance. As the sun rose over the mountaintop, golden light fell on thousands of shields, reflecting like a river of light flowing over the snowy mountains. Finally, they reached Pavia, the capital of the Lombards. The city was fortified with towering gray stone walls, the Lombard banners fluttering in the wind, defying the northern army. Charles did not hesitate. He ordered a siege. The siege of Pavia lasted for weeks. In the rain and wind, the Franks camped around the city, drums and horns echoed day and night. Arrows flew from the sky, stones from catapults pounded against the walls. The shouts and the clash of swords mixed with the thunder, turning the place into a song of war. Inside the command tent, Charles sat before the map, his eyes cold. He knew that if Pavia fell, all of northern Italy would be in his hands. And more than that, his title would extend beyond the Frankish lands, the young king who united and defended Christianity. The day Pavia fell, it rained again, but it was the reign of victory. The Lombards knelt and presented the Lombard crown to Charles. He placed it on his head, his face calm but his heart burning with pride. This is only the beginning. Amidst the cheers of his soldiers and the distant ringing of church bells, Charlemagne was officially crowned king of two nations, the Franks and the Lombards. A new European legend had begun. After assuming the Lombard crown, Charlemagne returned to his capital with the glory of a conquering king. But the northern frontier was troubled. The Saxons, a stubborn tribe living in the forests and marshes, repeatedly invaded, sacked Frankish villages, and retreated into the endless forests. Charles understood that if this threat was not defeated, the dream of a unified empire would be an illusion. In the spring of 772, Charlemagne assembled a large army and marched north. Thousands of cavalrymen rode across the misty fields, the sound of war drums echoing in the distance. The neighboring lords saw the look in the young king's eyes and knew that this battle would be unforgiving. When they reached the land of the Saxons, the landscape was a wilderness they had never seen before: dark forests, muddy streams, scattered wooden villages hidden among the trees. The Saxons worshipped gods of the forest and war, and regarded the Franks as pagan invaders. The war dragged on for years, with cycles of revenge. The Franks burned Saxon villages and felled the sacred trees they worshipped. In return, the Saxons launched night raids, killing guards and burning food stores. Rain, frost, and muddy roads made each campaign a life-or-death struggle. One of the fiercest battles took place on the banks of the Weser River. The battle lasted all day. The sound of swords clashing on shields echoed through the forest, mixed with the screams of men and the neighing of horses. As dusk fell, the river was stained red with blood. Charlemagne stood in the light rain, looking at the bodies floating on the river, his eyes shining with cold determination. If you want peace, you must first sow fear. The climax of the violence came in 782, the massacre of Verdun. After the Saxons rebelled and betrayed the treaty, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 prisoners. The cry rang out across the riverbanks, and from then on, fear of the Iron King of the North spread throughout the Saxon lands. Despite the bloodshed, Charlemagne saw this as the only way to end the war and bring Christianity to this restless land. Crosses were erected where satyrs had once been, and church bells rang in place of the barbarian trumpets. As winter came, Charlemagne rode through the quiet land. The Saxon village was now subdued, and the cross flew from the newly erected church. But in his heart, this silence was not peace, but the heavy shadow of blood and fire. After years of conquest in the north, Charlemagne thought the Frankish kingdom was finally at peace. But the west was ringing with the call of glory and the challenge of fate. From the distant Pyrenees, Christian princes in Spain sent envoys asking for help. The Moors, powerful Muslim warriors from North Africa, had taken over most of the Iberian Peninsula. They invited Charlemagne to come to their aid, promising to open the gates if he would march his army over the mountains. The young king could not resist the opportunity. If the campaign succeeded, Charlemagne's name would be known throughout Europe, and he would become the defender of Christianity on the continent. In the summer of 778, the mighty Frankish army marched south. They passed through narrow passes, through steep mountains and deep ravines. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the morning mist, mixed with the sound of horns and church bells hanging from the carriages. Among them was Roland, Charlemagne's brave and loyal nephew, who commanded the rearguard. Roland's face was radiant with youthful radiance, but in his eyes shone the pride of a warrior ready to die for honor. When Charlemagne reached Saragossa, the native prince's promise to open the gates fell on deaf ears. The stone walls stood silent, save for the Moorish flags that fluttered. They had been betrayed. Charles understood that he was in for a tough fight. He ordered a retreat, leading his army miles back toward the Pyrenees. The roads were narrow, the forests thick, perfect for the deadly trap that fate awaited. As the army retreated through the Roncesvalles Pass, Moorish and Basque figures hid in the woods and mountains. Roland's rearguard was cut off in the misty valley. The alarm horn sounded. Arrows and stones rained down from above. The roars, the neighing of horses, and the cracking of shields combined into a tragic song of death. Roland fought to his last breath, his hands gripping the sword Durandal, his eyes turned to the gray sky. In his final moments, Roland blew the elephant horn with his last breath, the sound echoing across the mountains like a desperate call to Charlemagne. But when the king and reinforcements arrived, all was silence and fallen soldiers. Charlemagne bent over Roland's body. Rain fell among his tears. The Spanish campaign did not bring victory, leaving behind only a tragic epic. This story later became the Song of Roland, a tragic song of loyalty that echoed throughout the Middle Ages. In the winter of 800, a cold wind blew through the cobblestone streets of Rome, but the air was filled with anticipation. In St. Peter's Basilica, thousands of candles burned brightly, their shimmering light reflecting off the soaring domes and ancient white stone columns. Charlemagne, king of the Franks and Lombards, walked slowly down the red-carpeted aisle. His white fur cloak trailed behind him, his leather boots clicking heavily. On either side of him stood a long line of guards with shining spears. This was the moment he had been building up to his entire life. Before the papal throne, Charles knelt. Leo III, the silver-haired, sharp-eyed pope, stepped forward with a shining golden crown. In a moment of silence, except for the distant ringing of bells, the crown was placed on Charlemagne's head. Carolus Augustus, Imperator Romanorum. Latin echoed throughout the church. Charles Augustus, Roman Emperor. The crowd of priests and nobles knelt, shouting. The church music and the trumpets harmonized, like the song of an entire continent rising from the ashes of ancient Rome. Outside the square, the people of Rome rushed to their knees in the bitter cold. They saw the light of candles reflected from the church gate onto the crown, as if a golden star had just fallen to earth. Charlemagne did not smile at that moment. He stood straight, his face calm, but inside he felt a sense of pride and loneliness. He knew that from that moment on, he had become a symbol of all of Europe, but also a man bearing the burden of history. After the ceremony, in a private room at the back of the church, Charlemagne stood alone by the window looking out at Rome, glowing in the winter night. In the distance, the torches of the people glowed like a river of fire. He placed his hand on his crown, felt the coldness of the gold medal, and whispered to himself, "From now on, there is no turning back. There is only the way of kings." That night, long bells rang out throughout Rome. Europe awoke under the shadow of a new emperor, and history would forever engrave the name of Charlemagne, the father of Europe. After being crowned emperor, Charlemagne was no longer a king who knew only war. He began to think of a legacy that went beyond the bloody battlefields. One spring morning, from the balcony of his castle, he looked down on the city of Aachen, then just a small town beside hot springs. He smiled slightly. "From this place, I will build a capital worthy of an empire." In the years that followed, Aachen transformed into a giant construction site. Builders from Italy, Germany, and Gaul arrived. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed day and night. Stone walls rose under the hands of the workers, and arches gradually took shape under the cold European sky. Charlemagne personally rode to inspect the project. He envisioned a capital with palaces, cathedrals, schools, and libraries, where the light of knowledge would dispel the darkness of the Middle Ages. The Palatine Cathedral, the jewel of Aachen, slowly emerged with its soaring domes and its stained glass windows casting shimmering light onto the stone floors. As the bells rang for the first time, Charlemagne stood in the nave, feeling as though he had erected a symbol for all of Europe. Charlemagne not only built the city, but also brought the light of learning back to Europe. He invited scholars from England, Italy, and Iberia to Aachen, turning the capital into the center of the Carolingian Renaissance. In the classrooms, children chanted Latin. In the libraries, monks copied Bibles and ancient Roman texts, writing neatly by candlelight. Charlemagne, though he had never learned to read as a child, practiced writing every night. It is said that he kept a wax tablet and a pen by his bed so that when he could not sleep, he could practice writing his name. One winter night, in a room with only a blazing fire, Charlemagne took up his pen and tried to write each letter carefully on the wax tablet. His hands trembled from age and battle, but his eyes were steadfast. A great empire needs not only swords, but also wisdom. He whispered. Outside the window, snow fell silently on the city of Aachen, the capital of the new light. As he turned 60, Charlemagne rode through the newly rebuilt streets of Aachen. Cathedrals towered, libraries rang with the sounds of children studying, and mints and armories were still in operation. A quiet pride rose in his heart, different from the noisy joy of victory. This was the greatest victory of all, transforming a barbarian kingdom after the Roman era into the civilized center of Europe. In 810, Charlemagne turned 68, an age rare for medieval warriors. His hair was white, his voice was deeper, and his steps were heavier. But his eyes were still the eyes of the king who had shaken Europe, bright, deep, and far-sighted. Every morning he walked slowly down the cold stone corridors of the Aachen Palace. Outside were the buildings he had built, the Palatine, the school, the library, and the square filled with the sounds of children. But inside him, a strange feeling began to rise, a feeling of emptiness after glory. The empire now stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Elbe to the Ebro. But with its vastness came divisions. On the borders, distant lords began to defy orders, levy their own taxes, and secretly consort with enemies. Charles received news from Bavaria. A lord rebelled, refusing to pay taxes. He said, "Not every sword can cut down treason." Charlemagne had many sons, but the ones he had placed the greatest hopes in, Pepin and the young Charles, both died early, either from illness or accident. Only Louis remained, a quiet son who was more inclined to morality than to war. One night, Charles called Louis over and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I have paved the way with fire and blood. But you must keep it with wisdom and kindness." Louis bowed his head, saying nothing. In the candlelight, Charles saw the silhouette of an unprepared successor, and that frightened him more than a battle. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he sat alone in the library, a place that used to be bustling with students. The old books, the ink faded, were touched by his hands like old memories. He could no longer read much, his eyes were dim, but he still turned each page as if he were retracing his own footsteps. He looked back at the map of the empire, an old parchment with countless lands, mountains, rivers, and borders. But he no longer saw borders, only cracks, fissures in the rock of power he had once forged. In 813, winter came early. Charlemagne was suffering from a fever and a persistent cough. The doctors used herbs, acupuncture, and prayers, but he knew that the cold outside had now crept into his chest. In his dreams, he saw the dead, Roland riding on the mountainside, Charlemagne smiling under the trees, and himself, young, riding over the Alps with burning eyes. The next morning he woke up, his eyes unusually bright, and said, "I am ready." On January 28, 814, as snow covered the dome of Aachen, Emperor Charlemagne breathed his last in a cold stone chamber, beside a flickering fire and the sound of a silent prayer. There were no trumpets, no soldiers. Just an old man with white hair, sleeping peacefully like any other commoner, but also the greatest man Europe had seen in a millennium. The news of the king's death spread like wildfire. From Italy to Gaul, from the Danube to the Atlantic, soldiers and civilians knelt in silence. In Aachen, bells rang for 7 days and nights, and the Palatine Cathedral was bathed in candlelight. His body was laid in a marble tomb beneath the church, dressed in a white robe, wearing a golden crown, holding a sword and an open Bible. No one dared to cry out loud. The loss was too great to be expressed in tears. Charlemagne did not leave many words. No lengthy documents, just brief instructions. But his real legacy lies in Aachen, in the children who can read, in the churches that have stood the test of time, and in the epics that speak of him with reverence. An old soldier said as he knelt before the grave, "He is dead, but the path he opened is still brighter than fire." Louis ascended the throne, becoming Louis the Pious, but was unable to maintain the unity of the empire. After a generation, the empire was divided into 3 and gradually fractured into small kingdoms. However, what Charlemagne had built did not disappear. Schools, writing, legal systems, administrative structures became the foundations of medieval and Renaissance Europe. In 1165, nearly 400 years after his death, Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa ordered Charlemagne to be canonized. Although no miracles were recorded, it is believed that his very life, with all his achievements, was a miracle. He was called Saint Carolus Magnus, and Aachen became a place of pilgrimage. The golden, jeweled reliquary was placed high in the church, where the light shone on it, making it glow like the sun. Today, his name is engraved on monuments, schools, universities, and even on euro coins. He is a symbol of a united, strong, civilized Europe, a dream that generations have been trying to build. No one is alive to tell of his true voice, his gait, or his angry expression. But everyone knows who he was. A man, from the minority Frankish family, who built an empire, a culture, and a legend.